All right, everybody. Today we are going to talk about culture and climate. I'm going to try to keep this relatively brief and to the point so you won't have to sit through a long recorded lecture. So, jumping right in. So, what is culture? Culture is a term that's been widely adopted both in the research literature as well as in popular culture. And the meaning may differ between the popular culture meaning and the research meaning. And even within the research literature, this is a term that people just can't seem to agree on. You will read the Dennison article, and he is probably one of the leaders in culture, and even his definition of a culture differs from what's probably the most widely agreed upon definition. This definition is that culture represents shared mental assumptions that guide interpretation and action in organizations by defining appropriate behavior. This is very difficult to pinpoint exactly what culture is. You might think of it as the religion of an organization. It has to do with the values and histories and tradition. Culture is something that was put in place near the founding of the organization, or maybe when there was a big shift in who was in charge in that organization. The values that the people in charge have had for years and years. It's something that uh, really has this historical value. It's not something that can be changed easily. This really, that says lens through which members interpret the environment. People understand the organization through its culture. They understand it by looking at, well, what historically happens within this organization. Sometimes a culture can be stifling, right? If the organization traditionally does something in a certain way and continues to do it in that way, that organization could potentially fail. As for some other aspects of culture, only superficial layers of a culture are observable to outsiders. So, for somebody who's not in the organization, they don't necessarily have a good idea of what the culture looks like, what the history looks like. It takes an organizational insider to understand what the culture is. I mean, of course, people can see what the values statement is, what the mission statement is, but they can't really get an idea of the history of the organization, the traditions within that organization, the language within that organization without actually being in it. Because of this deep rooted aspect of culture, it's very, very difficult to change. A lot of times, people within organizations don't even realize that they're acting according to a specific culture. It's primarily unconscious, right? But nonetheless, they do suit their behaviors to fit within that culture. If culture change is going to happen, it takes a very large number of individuals. So, in addition to a shift in leadership, it has to have lower level manager buy in, it has to have base level employee buy in order for culture to change. It's also important to note that subcultures may exist. So within the broad culture, there may be these subcultures. Maybe one particular department has a very specific type of culture. Sales, for instance, has always done something in a very certain way, and they have their traditions and what works and so on. And that culture essentially functions within that particular unit. Now, in terms of types of cultures, Quinn and Cameron are probably the leaders in this area to best understand what types of culture an organization can have. They posited, and they have a book detailing this, that organizations can differ between two types of values. The first value is flexibility and discretion versus stability, order, and control. And the second value is internal affairs versus external environment. Now you can look at this 4x4 or 2x2 rather square over here, kind of Punnett square. The organizations can differ on internal focus versus external focus, and flexibility versus discretion. And based on what that organization is high in, that particular organization has a specific type of culture: clan, adhocracy, hierarchy, or market. So, an organization that has an internal focus and a focus on stability and control could be considered to be a hierarchy organization. This type of organization emphasizes procedures, rules, and policies. The organization is very structured, very controlled. There's a focus on efficiency, stability, doing things right, and so on. An example organization would be the government, many other large organizations. It's easy to run when you have a lot of people. It's easier to run an organization if you have a hierarchy, right? Focusing on the rules and so on. Now, if an organization has an external focus and a focus on stability and control, you would consider that to be a market culture. A market culture is very results oriented. There's a focus on competition, achievement, getting the job done, and really bottom line results. So, any organization that's really profit driven would be considered to be a market culture. If an organization has an internal focus, a focus on its employees, and values flexibility and discretion, this could be considered to be a clan culture. A clan culture emphasizes friendly internal environments and goals. So they're family-like. There's a focus on mentoring, training, nurturing, and doing things together. So more of a family-friendly type of organization where people are friends and buddy-buddy and so on. With an external focus and a focus on flexibility and discretion, an organization would be called an adhocracy. This is essentially an organization that's trying to promote creativity. They emphasize loose boundaries to solve problems and get results. So these are cultures that are dynamic and entrepreneurial. They focus on risk-taking, innovation, and doing things first. So you can think of a place like Google, where they're always trying to be really creative and so on. Now, there's not really, out of these, not really a good or bad type of culture. That's something important to realize. Rather, each one of these cultures could be appropriate depending on the goals of that organization. So the next major question is, what enforces and maintains an organization's culture? Really, what's maintaining a culture has a lot to do with the application and selection process. Remember, we talked about the ASA model of recruitment, attraction, selection, attrition model of recruitment. Well, that plays a huge role in maintaining a culture. People want to choose a culture or choose an organization that shares their values, and organizations want to choose people that fit the values of that organization. So right there, right at the very beginning, the organization is selecting people into it who would fit within that culture. Another major part of an organization's culture are rites and rituals. Ritual is just something that contributes to the operating procedure of an organization. But it really is more than that. It has a symbolic role where that ritual embodies the values of the organization. You can think of integration or community rituals. We have Halloween parties, cookouts, social activities, and so on. Those types of rituals foster a sense of community. We have rituals where people advance through organizations. We have rituals where people renew their knowledge, renew their understanding of an organization, renew an understanding of the traditions and the leadership of the organization. Really, these are incredibly important because they help people understand the values of the organization and remind people of the values in the organization. Artifacts and symbols are also important to enforcing and maintaining culture. Artifacts you can think of are the physical things that are found. Now, as you can see from the definition of culture, it's really a difficult thing to empirically study. Aside from some frameworks like the Quinn and Cameron framework, it's difficult to actually measure what culture is, given that it's largely unconscious. Climate, on the other hand, represents employees' shared perceptions of organizational policies and social norms. And given that climate is essentially assessing what people think about the organization and others, it becomes easier to measure and easier to assess. So there's a lot of research on climate, a lot of research on very disparate types of climate, justice climate, diversity climate, customer service climate, and so on. Typically, you conceptualize it as a climate for something. There are types, there's sort of a macro climate, microclimate. We tend to focus on climates for something as opposed to sort of macro climate. So let me give you an example. Liz and I recently had a paper published on diversity climate, where diversity climate essentially refers to the extent to which employees perceive that the organization values and promotes diversity. So this would involve the presence and enforcement of fair human resource policies and programs put in place for the social integration of employees who are members of these outgroups, of these underrepresented groups. So this essentially has to do with the organization supporting and promoting diversity. You can see something similar with the justice climate, whether or not people in that organization believe that the organization is just in the distribution of its rewards. So any of these could be considered to be a climate for one or the other construct. Now, typically climate is defined as shared perceptions of policies and social norms. A lot of times we aren't able to get shared perceptions. That involves assessing people within a group, within a department, and so on. And a lot of times our research is limited by that. So oftentimes what we do is we rely on what we call psychological climate. And that's essentially an individual's perception of organizational policies and social norms. And psychological climate has been shown to be almost as predictive as shared perceptions. So it's still pretty good. You can still assess climate from just one person. Now, climate is less broad than culture. Climate is oftentimes specific to a certain subgroup in that organization. For instance, back when I was working as a bank teller, I worked at several different branches. I floated from branch to branch occasionally. And it was amazing how different the climate was in terms of those different branches. I mean, you see that. You see different things that people value within the minor branches, the smaller branches. And it was pretty evident that climates could be very different within different groups of people. Now, this can be a little bit more malleable than culture. Given that culture is unconscious, there's not very much control over it. But in terms of people's perceptions of policies and social norms, well, organizations can actually control policies and practices. So if they realize that, well, people don't find this organization to be just, they have shared perceptions of injustice, well, they can do something. They can change something there. Social norms are also possible to change, although a little bit more difficult. One way to change social norms is to introduce new people into the organization. New people, particularly new management, have a pretty big opportunity to change the social norms and change what is accepted within that particular group. There's also been shown to be effective interventions that can increase a particular type of climate. For instance, safety climate is studied pretty frequently in the literature, and a lot of times you're working in climates where construction workers, firefighters, typically all male climates where it's important to be macho, right? Well, interventions have been shown to be effective in those cultures, essentially changing people's beliefs about how the importance of safety and the organization can control the policies and practices and so on to make sure that people are wearing their safety equipment. So that can be effective. interventions have been shown to be effective in changing pretty much all types of climate, but they tend to be pretty time consuming and pretty intense. So that's all I want to talk about today for culture and climate. Definitely let me know if you have questions. I'll be available through email, and then Dr. Dennis Devine will be leading, well, at least supervising your discussion of climate and culture. Have a good day, everybody.